Synopsis of the Books of the Bible. 1 Peter. By JND Darby. New Testament. 1 Peter. Chapter 5. Exhortation to fellow elders, Peter's place as a witness to Christ's sufferings and future partaker of glory. 1 Peter 5. The Apostle returns to Christian details. He exhorts the elders, himself an elder, for it appears that among the Jews this title was rather characteristic than official. Compare verse 5. He exhorts them to feed the flock of God. The apostle designates himself as one who had been a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and who was to be a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. It was the function of the 12 to be witnesses of the life of Christ, John 15, as it was that of the Holy Ghost to testify of his heavenly glory. Peter places himself at the two ends of the Lord's history and leaves the interval devoid of all except hope, and the pilgrimage towards an end. He had seen the sufferings of Christ. He was to share his glory when he should be revealed. It is a Christ who puts himself in relation to the Jews, now known only by faith. During his life on earth, he was in the midst of the Jews although suffering there and rejected. When he shall appear, he will again be in relation to the earth and with that nation. The standpoint of Paul. Paul speaks differently, while at the same time confirming these truths. He only knew the Lord after his exaltation. He is not a witness of his sufferings, but he seeks for the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of his sufferings. Paul's heart is bound to Christ while he is in heaven, as united to him above, and, although he desires the Lord's appearing for the restitution of all things of which the prophets had spoken, he rejoices to know that he shall go with joy to meet him, and shall return with him when he is revealed from heaven. The care of the flock of God for the sake of the chief shepherd. The elders were to feed the flock of God with a ready mind and not as by constraint, nor for gain, nor as governing inheritance of their own, but as ensamples to the flock. Loving care was to be lavished upon it, for the sake of Christ, the chief shepherd, with a view to the good of souls. Moreover, it was the flock of God which they were to feed. What a solemn as well as sweet thought! How impossible for anyone to entertain the notion of its being his flock if he has laid hold of the thought that it is the flock of God and that God allows us to feed it. The Lord's perfect grace to Peter, his heart's desire, his reward. We may observe that the heart of the blessed apostle is where the Lord had placed it. "Feed my sheep" was the expression of the Lord's perfect grace towards Peter when he was leading him to the humiliating but salutary confession that it needed the eye of God to see that his weak disciple loved him. At the moment that he convinced him of his utter nothingness, he entrusted to him that which was dearest to himself. Thus we see, here, that it is the apostle's care, the desire of the heart, that they should feed the flock. Here, as elsewhere, he does not go beyond the Lord's appearing. It is at that period that the ways of God in government, of which the Jews were the earthly center, shall be fully manifested. Then shall the crown of glory be presented to him that has been faithful, that has satisfied the chief shepherd's heart. Exhortations and encouragements to obey the principles of God's government. The young were to submit themselves to those who were older, and all to one another. All were to be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, and gives grace to the humble. These are still the principles of his government. Under his hand they were therefore to humble themselves. They should be exalted in due time. This was to commit themselves to God. He knew what was needful. He who loved them would exalt them at the right time. He cared for them, they were to rest on him, commit all their cares to him. Exhortations to soberness and vigilance against their adversary, the God of grace calling his people to share his eternal glory and establishing and strengthening them here. On the other hand, they were to be sober and vigilant, because the adversary sought to devour them. Here, whatever may be his wiles, however he may lie in wait for Christians, it is in the character of a roaring lion, one who excites open persecution, that the apostle presents him. They were to resist him, steadfast in the faith. Everywhere the same afflictions were found. Nevertheless, the God of grace is the Christian's confidence. He has called us to participate in his eternal glory. The apostle's desire for them is, that, after they had suffered for a time, the God of grace should make them perfect, complete, should establish and strengthen them, building up their hearts on the foundation of an assurance that cannot be shaken. To him, he adds, be glory and dominion. The circumstances of the Christians to whom Peter wrote, the Christians' hope and patience. We see that the Christians to whom he wrote were suffering and that the apostle explained these sufferings on the principles of the divine government, with regard especially to the relation of Christians with God, as being his house, whether those sufferings were for righteousness' sake, or for the name of the Lord. It was but for a time. The Christians' hope was elsewhere, Christian patience was well-pleasing to God. It was their glory if it was for the name of Christ. Besides which, God judged his house and watched over his people,